In the winter of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd tossed a stone into a dark cave along the cliffs of the Dead Sea. The sound he heard was not the strike of rock on earth, but the shattering of pottery. Inside those jars lay a collection of scrolls that would shock the academic world and forever silence the critics of biblical history. Among them was a perfectly preserved manuscript of the prophet Isaiah. This scroll, written over a century before the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, contained a passage so specific, so haunting, and so mathematically improbable that it has been called the fifth gospel. It describes a man who would be crushed for the sins of others. It describes a man who would be pierced in a way that was not yet invented as a form of execution. This is the story of Isaiah 53, the prophecy that predicted the crucifixion 7 centuries before it happened. To understand the weight of this prophecy, we must travel back nearly 3,000 years. We must travel back to the 8th century before Christ. The world was a place of iron and blood. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was the superpower of the day, a machine of war that moved across the ancient Near East like a slow, dark tide. In the middle of this geopolitical storm stood a man named Isaiah. He was a counselor to kings and a voice for the divine. His writings are complex, poetic, and filled with grand visions of the future. But nestled within the latter half of his book is a series of poems known as the Servant Songs. The most famous of these begins at the end of chapter 52. It carries through the entirety of chapter 53. It does not speak of a conquering king or a military hero. Instead, it speaks of a suffering servant who would change the course of human history through his own destruction. For centuries, skeptics argued that Isaiah 53 was too accurate. Skeptics claimed it must have been written after the life of Jesus and inserted into the text by later Christians. This argument was the standard academic position until those caves at Qumran were opened. The great Isaiah scroll found there is dated to at least 100 years before the birth of Christ. It contains the entire text of chapter 53 exactly as we have it in our modern Bibles. This find proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the description of the suffering servant was not a postscript written by followers of Jesus. It was a pre-scripted blueprint that sat in the hands of Jewish scholars. It sat in the hands of Jewish scholars for generations before the first Roman nail was ever driven into a cross. The prophecy begins by describing the servant appearance and his reception by the world. Isaiah writes that he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance. Isaiah writes that there was nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. This stands in stark contrast to the heroes of ancient mythology who were always depicted as physically perfect and godlike. Isaiah tells us that this servant would be despised and rejected by mankind, a man of sorrows. He would be a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. This accurately reflects the life of Jesus, who is not a political revolutionary or a man of wealth, but a humble carpenter from a rejected town. He was a carpenter who was ultimately abandoned by his closest friends and condemned by the religious elite of his day. One of the most staggering details in Isaiah writing is the mention of the servant being pierced. In the Hebrew text, the word used is chalel, which means to be bored through. At the time Isaiah was writing, the standard method of capital punishment in Israel was stoning. The concept of crucifixion was entirely unknown. It would not be invented by the Persians for another 2 centuries, and it would not be refined into a systematic form of execution by the Romans for hundreds of years. It would not be refined for hundreds of years after that. Yet, 700 years before the Roman Empire even existed, Isaiah recorded that the Messiah would be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. He described the specific physical trauma of the cross long before the cross. He described it long before the cross was ever conceived as a tool of death. The prophecy continues by detailing the servant demeanor during his trial and execution. Isaiah writes that he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. This is perhaps one of the most unique aspects of the trial of Jesus. When he was brought before Pontius Pilate and the Sanhedrin, he did not offer a legal defense. He did not beg for his life or incite a riot among his followers. He remained largely silent, accepting the sentence as if it were a preordained destiny. Isaiah captured this specific psychological and behavioral trait with haunting precision centuries before the trial took place. Even the details of the servant death and burial are foretold. Verse 9 states that he was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death. This is a fascinating paradox. Normally, a person executed as a criminal by the state would be thrown into a common pit or left for scavengers. They would die with the wicked and be buried with the wicked. However, the New Testament records that while Jesus was executed between two thieves, a wealthy man named Joseph of Arimathea requested the body and buried him in his own private, expensive tomb. Isaiah predicted this exact contradiction. The servant would be treated as a criminal, but honored by the wealthy. At the heart of Isaiah 53 is the reason for this suffering. The prophet explains that this was not a tragic accident or a miscarriage of justice in the eyes of God. He writes that the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. This is the concept of substitution. The servant takes the punishment that others deserved. Isaiah says that by his wounds we are healed. This is the theological core of the Christian faith, yet it was written in the heart of the Jewish scriptures long before the first church was ever formed. The prophet describes a transaction. He describes a transaction where the guilt of the many is transferred to the one who is innocent. This servant who had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth, became the sacrifice that bridged the gap between the divine and the human. The prophecy does not end with a grave. After describing the servant death and burial, Isaiah makes an astounding claim. He says that after he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. He writes that the servant will see his offspring and prolong his days. How can a man who has been cut off from the living see his offspring? How can a man buried in a tomb see his offspring or have his days prolonged? This is a clear allusion to the resurrection. Isaiah predicts that the servant death is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a justification for many. He will share a portion with the great and divide the spoils. He will divide the spoils with the strong because he poured out his life unto death. The odds of a single person fulfilling just 8 of the specific prophecies found in the Old Testament are calculated at 1 in 100 quadrillion. Isaiah 53 alone contains over a dozen specific details. These details were lived out in the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. Whether you view this as a matter of faith or a mystery of history, the existence of the great Isaiah scroll proves that these words were waiting in the desert for 2,000 years to tell their story. If you found this journey through ancient prophecy compelling, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell to join us as we uncover more mysteries of the ancient world. Your support allows us to continue producing these cinematic documentaries. Thank you for watching.